It's so good to see everyone. I love this moment when we open the rooms, if you will, and everybody starts flooding in. And I welcome you to put where you're coming from into the chat if you'd like. That's also fun to see just where everybody is joining us from. So it's so good to see you. I think today is International Women's Day, so
Mhm.
welcome to that. And our guests tune in from across the country and even around the world. So today's reading will be recorded. It will be available on our website afterwards if you miss any part of it, if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with friends, you're welcome to. I want to say just a few words about upcoming events on the Poets Corner before we begin today's program. And I'll start with the 2026 Camden Festival of Poetry. That is here in Camden, Maine, where I am, from May 12th through the 16th, with most of the festival events taking place on Saturday, the 16th. Our keynote features the poet and essayist Amy Nizuku Matato, and her craft talk, which is Friday afternoon, and her keynote address during the festival on Saturday are both available over Zoom. If you sign up on the Camden Festival of Poetry.org website. So even if you can't come to Camden, Maine in May, which it tends to be quite beautiful here in May, but you can still attend parts of the festival. So that would be great. There's also a podcast on the website of me reading two of Amy's poems and talking about them. The podcast is called Poetry Medicine for the Soul, and you might want to just check that out, and maybe that will encourage you to make a trip to Camden to hear Amy Nizuku Matato. Also new on the Poets Corner, we've started posting book reviews in a section on our website titled The Observatory, and it's also the poetscorner.org/reviews. And there'll be a new review every month talking about a recently published book of poetry. On Sunday, March 22nd, we have three Palestinian American poets in a program entitled Voices from the Diaspora. Zina Azam, Sarah Abdu Rashad, and Dina Shihabi will all read from their work and be in conversation with our host for that event, Mark S. Burrows. On Sunday, April 12th, we have a reading from the anthology The Nature of Our Times, a companion to the very first ever National Nature and Wildlife Assessment. The anthology includes 210 poets, and 12 of them will be reading their work on the Poets Corner and talking about what it means to write poetry as part of our assessment of where we are in our relationship with nature and wildlife and what our future might hold. So it's a lot to remember. You just have to visit our website, thepoetscorner.org, and all of it's right there, and you can sign up for anything that catches your interest. So, on to today's reading. We are featuring today Patty Crane, who's the translator of this beautiful volume of poems called The Blue House, poems by Tomas Tranströmer. The Blue House received the 2024 PEN Award for Poetry in Translation. We're excited to spend this afternoon with Patty reading his poems and also talking about the work of translation and what it means and what it does for us. Patty lived in Sweden at one time. She knew Tomas Tranströmer and his wife, Monica. And after his death, actually, I believe, worked with his wife on some of the translations she included in this book. She's author of her own poetry collection, Bell I Wake To, and a chapbook called Something Flown. Patty's poems and her translations have appeared in numerous poetry journals. The Blue House is a significant contribution to our understanding of an internationally renowned poet, the winner of the Nobel Prize, and a poet that, as I understand it, Patty admired for decades, reading him in translation before she began to translate his work herself. I'm sure she'll tell us more about that. But for right now, let's just welcome Patty Crane to the Poets Book Corner.
Thank you so much, Meg, and the Poets Corner, Liz and Lucas, and thank all of you for joining in. It's lovely to be reading from this work. So as Meg kind of alluded to, the Blue House is the culmination of close to 15 years devoted to my obsession with Tomas Tranströmer. And yeah, I thought it might be helpful to just share a little bit of background before reading, just sort of some high points about him, that Tomas himself, and then a little bit about how I ended up here. So Tomas was a Swedish poet, and he was born in 1931. And he balanced from a pretty early age an active writing life with a full career as a psychologist. He worked mainly with juveniles in prison as well as those with addiction issues. His first book of poetry, he studied poetry in high school, of course, seriously, but his first book of poetry was published at the young age of 23. So that was in 1954. And to fairly immediate acclaim. And then he put out another nine books of poetry, probably a book every 3 or 4 years before in 1990, when he was just 60 years old, he had a stroke that left him aphasic and with right-sided paralysis. He subsequently published one book of prose and then two more full collections of poetry, the last one being The Great Enigma, and that was in 2004. His work has been translated into dozens of languages, won numerous prestigious international awards, and yes, as Meg mentioned, the ultimate being the Nobel Prize in Literature, and that was in 2011. Some of you may know that Tomas was an accomplished pianist, and after the stroke, trained himself to play with his left hand. Music was a critical force in his work and his life right to the end. He died in 2015 at the age of 83. How did I come to this work? So as Meg said, yes, there was a 3 year period living in Sweden, and I had gained sufficient fluency in the language to begin reading him in Swedish. And yes, up to that point, I had been a very close reader of his work, a huge fan, and I'd read his work in various translations for at least a decade. But being able to read them in the original, I'm sure you can imagine, felt entirely new. So mostly, I started translating out of excited curiosity. You know, I really wanted to mirror my experience of reading the original, and of course I saw it as a way to enter his poems more fully while honing my Swedish. And then, you know, quite obviously, one poem led to the next and the next. Um, and ultimately, thanks to the dear late amazing poet Jean Valentine, who who saw to it that I met Tomas, introduced us, and I had that wonderful luck of meeting and then ultimately befriending Tomas and his wife Monica, and spent a good deal of time with them. And then eventually, while still there in Sweden, had the opportunity to work with them on some of my early translations. And Tomas was alive at that point. Uh, so ultimately, this my first book of translations. This is a little bit beat up on the cover. Bright Side is a selection of his work, and this came out in 2015 from Saraban Books, and it came out before Thomas. I'm sorry, it came out after Thomas died. And the Sorrow Gondola, which is one of his collections, a 1990 collection. Those were the poems that, while he was alive and while I was living in Sweden, that we worked on. That they had a look at my translations and we had some conversation about it. But the Blue House, what I'll be reading from today, is everything that was in the Bright Side, but his full collected work. So this is all 13 poetry collections, and then his collection of prose. And it came out in 2023 from Copper Canyon Press, and I think they did a beautiful job. It does include Facing Swedish, so that's why it's so beastly. Um, about Tomas's poems, they're grounded in everyday life, and often nature is a touchstone. Um, but and they slip fluidly into and out of more liminal realms. And a lot has been said about this. Um, Between dreaming and waking, past and present, present and future, he just seems to be able to ricochet almost in between these spaces, while at the same time being grounded to what's right before him. And so he's essentially simultaneously and deeply attentive to the inner and the outer worlds. And for me, I think the magic of his poems is how his first person I becomes transparent, and then we're given these, mysterious glimpses into existence and, in many cases, the human condition. And I suspect it's what makes so many of his poems feel timeless and why he's so beloved. So my plan is to read for about 15 minutes, and because I have, often readings, I don't have quite so much time, and it's always difficult to choose because there's so much wonderful work to choose from. But I don't often have time to read from his prose pieces, and I would like to do that. Just a couple of short excerpts from the collection is called Memories Watch Me. It was published in 1993, and it's a prose collection of about 8 pieces that are, basically reflecting on his most vivid and influential memories from his childhood and adolescence. And they really don't get much attention, but they offer, in my opinion, unique and pretty charming glimpses into his development as a person and a poet. And I hope that even these two brief passages that I'll read offer a peek into the creation of a mind that, moves so fluidly, within and between those liminal realms. So the first one I'm going to read from is titled Museums. And from a very young age, like 5 years old, Thomas was drawn to museums, and especially the Natural History Museum in Stockholm. And there's some really wonderful descriptions in here about his experiences there. But in particular, he loved invertebrates, so much so that he started collecting his own invertebrates right around the age of 11. And he did that for a good number of years. And he had the trays, and he euthanized them and had the trays and the pins, and he kept them in a closet at home. And of that, he says, and inside my skull, a huge museum evolved, and an interplay arose between this fantasy museum and the very real one I'd been visiting. So he spent he grew up he spent his summers in the little island called Runmerö, a summer cottage that his family had there, and he had his net and would run around the island and enlist all the neighbor kids to catch insects. And so here's what he says. I went on endless excursions, an outdoor life without the slightest regard for its health benefits. Naturally, I had no aesthetic views about my catches. This was science, after all. But I frequently experienced beauty without ever knowing it. I moved within the great mystery. I learned that the land was alive, that there was an infinitely large crawling and flying world that lived its own rich life without caring the slightest bit about us. I caught a fraction of that world and pinned it in my trays, which I still have, a hidden mini museum that I'm hardly ever aware of. But they're in there, the insects, as if biding their time. So this second piece, the prose piece that I will read a little bit from is titled Secondary School. And secondary school in Sweden and is, we could say, from the fifth to the ninth grade. And he talks about rules and teachers and, kind of influential teachers. And but poignantly, he talks about his best friend Palle. And Palle, like Tomas, was an only child, and like Tomas, Palle's father was not around. And most especially like Tomas, he was a great collector of things, and he loved to explore. So they did a lot together outside. And but in about the seventh and eighth grade, they drifted apart because Palle was absent a lot. And Tomas says when he returned to school, he was pale, serious, and had an amputated leg. When Palle died, I simply couldn't process the fact. I had a guilty conscience, but refused to acknowledge it. It felt as if I was supposed to erase all memory of the fun we had. I feel as if I'm the same age as Palle, even though he died 45 years ago without having grown up. But my old teachers, the old men as we called them, remain old men in my memory, even though the older ones were the age I am now as I write this. You always feel younger than you are. I carry my earlier faces inside me the way a tree holds its annual rings. It's the sum of all who are I. The mirror only sees my latest face. I feel all my previous ones. So, so now I'll read you six short poems, and I'm going to try my best to keep my commentary on them to a minimum. But I do look forward to talking more about the poems and translation afterwards. Also, I'm reading them in a somewhat non-chronological order, in case that's of interest. Tracks. 2 o'clock at night, moonlight. The train has stopped out in the middle of the field. Distant points of light from a city flickering coldly on the horizon. As when a person has gone into a dream so deep, she'll never remember she was there when she returns to her room. Or when someone has gone into an illness so deep, his days all become a few flickering points, a swarm, cold and light on the horizon. The train stands completely still. 2 o'clock, strong moonlight, few stars. Face to face. In February, existence stood still. Birds didn't fly willingly, and the soul chafed against the landscape the way a boat chafes against the dock it lies moored to. The trees stood with their backs to us. Snow depth was measured with dead straw. Footprints grew old out on the crust. Under a tarp, language withered. One day, something appeared at the window. Work came to a halt. I looked up. The colors burned. Everything turned around. The land and I sprang toward each other. Tomas has um, a number of incredibly beautiful, long poems that are often difficult to read in a reading. Sometimes it's just hard to, you know, for people to kind of stay with it. So I often don't have the opportunity to read them in a reading, but I'm not going to read a full long poem today, but I would really like to read a part of a very long and beautiful poem, and this one is called Schubertiana. And it's a long, sweeping, gorgeous poem that's written in 5 parts that was inspired by Franz Schubert's string quintets. And and I love it so much because it speaks to the power and the truth of music. And I'm telling you this because you're not hearing the whole poem, but it speaks to the power and truth of music as kind of a counterweight to modern existence. And I'm going to read you part 4 from Schubertiana. So much trust we must have just to live our daily lives without sinking through the earth. Trust in the masses of snow clinging to the mountain slopes over the village. Trust in the promises to keep silent and the smile of a chord. Trust that the fateful telegram doesn't concern us and that the sudden axe blow from within never comes. Trust in the axles that carry us down the highway in the midst of the 300 times magnified swarm of steel bees. But none of this is actually worthy of our trust. The string quintet says we can trust something else. In what? In something else, and it follows us for a while on our way there. As when the light goes out in the stairwell and your hand follows with trust the blind railing that finds its way in the darkness. And if there are any of you who are reading along, you'll notice that I edited a word because somehow it was something that I missed in the final proofs. And feel free to ask me about it later if you want. Let's see. To friends behind a border. 1. I wrote to you so guardedly, but what I couldn't write swelled and swelled like an old-fashioned airship and finally drifted away through the night sky. 2. My letter is now with the censor. He lights his lamp. In the glare, my words fly up like monkeys in a cage, shaking the bars, quieting down, baring their teeth. 3. Read between the lines. We'll meet in 200 years when the microphones in the hotel walls are all forgotten and can finally sleep, become orthoceratites. I'm going to say something again. um, I chose this poem not just because I love it, but because I went down a strange and very satisfying translation rabbit hole on this one, and I'm sort of throwing out a prompt for if anyone wants to hear about it, because I'd love to tell you about it. Um, Memories watch me. A June morning when it's too early to wake, but too late to fall back asleep. I must go out into the greenness that's filled with memories, and they follow me with their gaze. They can't be seen. They blend completely in with the background, perfect chameleons. They're so near I can hear them breathing, even though the bird song is deafening. And the last poem that I'll read before we have some conversation, um, for better or worse, and I hope better, this poem has become, I don't know, I don't want to use the word signature for me in my readings, but it feels like a necessity. And I think it's possible that I've read it almost every time that I read, and I've read a lot from his work. And again, because it speaks to the power of music as a form of freedom and a way to address and counteract violence and justice. And I think this poem really exemplifies how and why his work holds up across borders, cultures, and time. Um, I will read it in Swedish first, in my American accent, and finish up in English. Allegro. Jag spelar Haydn efter en svart dag och känner en enkel värme i händerna. Tangenten är vil, milda hammare slår. Klangen är grön, livlig och stilla. Klangen säger att friheten finns och att någon inte ger kejsaren skatt. Jag känner händerna i mina Haydn-fikor och hammaren som ser lugnt på världen. Jag hissar Haydn-flaggan, det betyder vi ger oss inte, men vill fred. Musiken är ett glashus på slutningen, där stenarna flyger, stenar rullar. Och stenarna rullar tvärs igenom, men varje ruta förblir hel. Allegro. I play Haydn after a black day and feel a simple warmth in my hands. The keys are willing. Gentle hammers strike. The tone is green, lively, and calm. The tone says that freedom exists and someone isn't paying the emperor tax. I shove my hands down into my Haydn pockets and act like someone who looks calmly at the world. I hoist the Haydn flag. It signifies we won't give in, but want peace. The music is a glass house on a slope where stones are flying, stones are rolling, and the stones roll straight through, but every pane remains whole. Thank you.
Patty, that was just beautiful. And I love that Allegro poem. And I think so many others commented that it was a favorite of theirs. So
Oh, good.
I think I came across a YouTube recording of him playing and reading that with an overlay of him reading. It was just gorgeous. So, geez, so many questions. I get to some in the chat, but I'm going to start with a few of my own if I could. So I just want to start with how you discovered the work of Tomas Tranströmer. Were you already writing your own poetry? Did it just grab you right away? What was your process of discovery?
Um, well, one thing that's that's probably important to point out is that I didn't start out in this arena, that I am a registered nurse and worked in nursing for, many years. And let's see, how many years ago now? Close to 30 years ago, I I took a leave from work to go back to get my master's and pursue my real passion since my youth, which was in poetry. And it was in while I was in graduate school that I was exposed to Tomas. I had no exposure to him prior to that. So I can't quite remember at what point in graduate school, but his poetry spoke to me immediately. And I, honestly, I, obviously was reading it in translation, um, and if I can, I will be really honest and say that I couldn't say what it was I loved. But and I have I think it was Robert Bly's translation, and it was just covered with post-it notes in certain stanzas because there were just things that stayed with me that I felt in my gut. So that's when it all started, and then I was hooked. Um,
I think sometimes we feel a poem that maybe intellectually we can't put together the meaning, if you will, but we can walk away with an image or a feeling that it um, leaves us with. And so I'm wondering how that impacts your process of translation. It seems like it might have taken a lot of courage to start translating poems as a relatively new speaker of the language. So how did how did that speak to you and how did you, I don't want to say justify that, but how did you, what was it doing for you? Why were you drawn to actually doing your own translations?
um, Well, the ability, the shock, I will say, of so the background of me loving Tomas's work, and when we moved to Sweden, I brought those were the books I brought with me. I didn't have, I couldn't bring a lot of books, and I definitely brought his books with me, of course, and as I was learning the language, I chose to take it's called Swedish for Immigrants classes that were I lived in south of Stockholm, and I just wanted to have a more sort of local experience rather than going to the university to learn the language. So, it was very intense. And ultimately, I got the Swedish as a second language. And when, I thought, okay, now I'm getting into the language enough that I said, I'm gonna go to the library and I'm just gonna look for some poetry that in Swedish. And I went to our local library, and there was I think it must have been the Sorrow Gone. There were two books, and I can't quite remember what the second one is. I since have bought them. Um, uh, and and it shocked me that I could read it in this other language. And as I said, it was really more, wow, I'm hearing something different, I'm seeing something different. And it could just, so much of that could have just been the fact that I was having this experience. I was having this experience in another place with another culture, and then this work that I thought I was very familiar with, and then suddenly it was different and I understood it. And so, it was I wasn't doing it to share with anyone. I was doing it to just be like, oh wow, I'm gonna see what I can make of this, and get better at my Swedish, and see what, I don't know, was I missing anything, or what am I taking away from it? So that's pretty much That was pretty much the experience. And it honestly wasn't until I really didn't tell anyone about it. And I happened to, that it slipped out when I had run into Jean Valentine. I was back in the States, and I had told her that I had translated the Sorrow Gondola, and she really wanted me to meet Tomas, and she honestly made that happen. I would have been too shy too. So, it just kind of morphed that way. But I wouldn't I didn't feel confident about it. I just felt very excited about it.
That's lovely. And then, but so many other people had translated its work. What gave you the confidence to then go out and publish some of your translations?
Well, again, this is where the community comes in. This is what poetry community is about because, I very much, as I said, I was not in any way thinking about anything other than I love this work, I love this language, I love this culture, and let's just do this and get deeper into it, and then, sharing that I had done it with Jean and then meeting with the Tranströmers. And then at the time, I was doing a postgraduate residency at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and the mentor that I was working with, the wonderful David Wojan, shared with him, and he was encouraging, and just other people along the way, just helped me say, just you should send this to this magazine, and one thing led to another. So that's kind of how it evolved.
And were they poems that had not been translated before?
Uh,
Or they were new
they're
translations.
new translations.
Yeah, lovely. The chat is like burning up with lots of good
Oh,
questions
good. Oh,
here.
good.
So I'm going to switch to some of those if I can. First of all, Jenny asked about the translation rabbit hole. What you
Oh,
mentioned the
thank you.
translation rabbit hole.
You took the prompt. Okay, this will take a few minutes to explain, but this is where the nerdiness of translation comes in. But I need to come back to this poem because the poem "To Friends Behind a Border," that's the one that
What page is it on in case
it's
anybody
yeah,
has the
it's
book?
on page 237 in the Blue House. It is not in Bright Scythe.
Okay.
And in the poem "To Friends Behind a Border," even the title suggests that it's clearly a poem about censorship and surveillance. And and so let me just read the last. It's in three parts, and each part is just 3 lines long. So let me read that last part, the last 3 lines. It starts with he's writing to these friends behind the border in the first part. In the second part, the letter is now with the censor, and the words are kind of baring their teeth at the censor. And then in the third part, here it is. Read between the lines. We'll meet in 200 years when the microphones in the hotel walls are all forgotten and can finally sleep, become orthoceratites. Now, that last word, orthoceratites, I'm fairly certain those of you, most people just don't know what that is. So orthoceratiter is the Swedish word, and that translates directly into orthoceratites. And not only is it kind of it's a strange sort of mouthful, and but I was, kind of going with it, and I but it for the longest time I just found it a really confusing invisible image, and I felt something was missing. I felt that image was so important to Tomas in some way, and I knew that an orthoceratite is a fossil. I actually have a small collection of fossils myself. And I had seen other translations of this poem where uh, they used words for orthoceratiter like ammonite and trilobite, which sound a lot better. They sound better to me. One of those is far more accurate than the other. And I had come up with a few others, and ultimately, the most promising one that I could come up with was mollusk fossils, which, is kind of strange, but it sounded good. And right up until I would say, it left me uneasy. I didn't like it, and and really close to the final proof time for this book, it occurred to me, I don't know why it hadn't, to look through my own small collection of fossils. Oh God, what did I do with them? They're there. So it occurred to me to look through my own small collection of fossils, and sure enough, I had ammonites and I had an orthoceratite, and then it all became clear. So I want to show you. This is like show and tell. I've never done this kind of show and tell. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is not an orthoceratite.
Okay.
These are ammonites, and you see they're beautiful, kind of round, spiral. Keep thinking of those last lines. The microphones in the hotel walls are all forgotten and can finally sleep become orthoceratites. So these are ammonites right here,
Mm.
right? And here is an orthoceratite. Does
Ooh,
this look like a
isn't
microphone
that
to you? That's
beautiful?
that.
Yeah.
All right. So to me, this all became clear, and I got excited because to me, one of these things looks like a microphone. And in my mind, this is very much what an orthoceratite is. This is very much what Tomas, the precocious um, scientist whose passion was invertebrates, this is the image that he had in his head. Um, when he that I think elevated the poem for him. Orthoceratites are specific to Sweden and the Baltic
Mm.
states. And this poem was written during the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, two friends behind a border. And it speaks to the power of Earth time over human time from a classic Tranströmer cosmic geologic perspective. So maybe you can imagine that it does seem kind of nerdy, but I was so excited, and I was very excited that I recognize it for a lot of people that image, you're gonna have to look it up and you're gonna have to see that that certainly is what drove it. So that was the fun little rabbit hole that I went down. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for the rabbit hole and for the show and tell. That was wonderful. And it just opens up the poem in a new way for many of us. It's lovely. So I've got a question from Ellen Goldsmith here that she says she's not quite sure how to ask it. It's a question, another question about translation. And she says, I've been reading along with some of the poems in a translation by Robin Fulton.
Mhm.
And I noticed changes in words and sentence structure in your translation. So a stab at the question, what made you make changes in how others translated the poem? I wonder if you were even reading other translations. You probably weren't. You're probably working directly from the Swedish and it came out differently. I don't know.
Thank you for that question, Ellen. And I think you did a good job at, framing the question. And you're right, Meg. Keeping in mind that this is, you know, I was working from the Swedish. I had two different Swedish collections in addition, Swedish collections of his works, some that wasn't the complete collection from his newer books, and then everything, that included the prose. And then I also had two of his individual collections that were part of the larger book. And I intentionally did not want to see any other translations because I knew they were out there. I hadn't really read much of Fulton, but was until farther into graduate school. I had mostly my introduction was early on, and that was mostly Robert Bly, and there are others. Um, and but it felt like I needed to, as I had said before, talking about my experience reading that Swedish, and I didn't want to have anything in my head. Now I'm working on a different translation project, and now, I have too much experience now to sort of worry about that because it's not well, without going down another, rabbit hole discussion, um, choices that we make have much to do with not just a word, but all of the words around that word, to be kind of vague. But if there's a particular kind of rhythm or meter, or maybe even some little bit of rhyming that's going on, any word choice that you make, we have so many words available to us in English compared to many other languages. And so any word choice you make starts to lead you in a direction, at least for me in translation, that leads to this kind of thing. The words are the words, the translation is the translation, but it's not like a technical science. This is poetry, so there's a lot of other things you're keeping in mind, that have to do with, some of it has to do with where what your English base is. Robin Fulton was in Scotland, and am I right about that? Yes. And, there's maybe more of a, kind of a UK British, sort of British English. And um, so, we might have different words and sensibilities. I don't know, if I don't want to go on too long, but I'm hoping um, that is a good answer.
I think it is. I was listening to this other reading you were on with Copper Canyon, and Arthur Z was talking about his new book that I think is just
Mhm.
coming out, Transient Worlds on Translating Poetry.
Mhm.
And he was saying he includes 3 or 4 different translations of certain poems. And I think the conversation was really that each of us brings ourselves to the work of translation and wants to share our experience of the poem as much as it's not a literal science of this word to that word, if you will. I'm not a translator. I've never translated anything. So I'm wondering if that's true for your experience and how many liberties, if you will, you take in that process.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and it is true, that translators bring absolutely. I've written about this actually, that we each do bring something, um, that's our own to the work, and that's just the nature of, we have different ways of thinking, different ways of processing, different life situations, different time periods, and the wonderful um, book that is, I think, required reading for translators or people who are interested is Elliot Weinberger's, and oh God, I'm having a moment where I'm forgetting, but Elliot Weinberger and is 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei, and it's a very slim volume that was published quite a long time ago. I have it on my shelf somewhere behind me, and it is, I think it's like a 4-line ancient Chinese poem that 19 different translators translate, and the editors just talk about the different translations, and they're wildly different. And I think that essentially there is um, I mean, it's, there's people just making different choices for different reasons, and I think that it does speak kind of beautifully to how poetry does enter us, and and it's the wonderful thing that we, even you forget about translation. Even, I think one of the great things as a poet, when you hear from people telling you something about a particular poem you've written that was not at all intended, And it's the
Yeah.
greatest thing to hear because you want your poetry to be as expansive as possible. Um, so yeah.
So here's a question from Alma. She says, I think Swedish is a difficult language to learn. What was the most challenging aspect of learning Swedish for you? Was it grammar, pronunciation, something else? And she's asking, can you say the number seven in Swedish?
Who? Who?
Who?
Um, who? Is yes, I think it's true with a lot of languages. However difficult it was. I mean, there's many different, my brain is going in many different ways at once with that question, Alma. But um, uh, again, I was taking these Swedish for immigrants classes, and many of my classmates, a large percentage, because this was in 2007, 2008, when there were a lot of asylum seekers from particularly Iraq. And and so a lot of people in my class were speaking Arabic. And I just thought, I have nothing to complain about because I just don't know how they did it. Just, these brilliant people learning this completely different language in so many ways. And, compared to English, it's Germanic. I think maybe the hardest, there are some really difficult pronunciations. I think rhythmically, that's tricky. In some pronunciations, my daughter, my oldest daughter, was with us for a while when we were over there, and she had a Swedish boyfriend, and he he said to me, he asked me like about three different times, can you say the word frog in Swedish? And I just mustered it as best I could, and I thought I sounded so great. And he would just laugh and say, "Oh my gosh, I love that, groda." And if you're Swedish and you're listening, you're going to know why he said that. I don't know, but but I think that maybe one of the trickiest things is as a poet, the rhythmic, the different sort of um, inflection, poses some interesting issues, and the use of compound words, particularly with poets who are known to do that, and Thomas does that, and people like Harry Martinson, and so you have to get very you have the grammar wasn't so much of a problem because I learned it early on. I had a good teacher right before we went to Sweden. It was a local woman who, I had a great book and learned that putting it all together was the best way to do it, learning from the basics. So I didn't find the grammar hard, but the compound words often threw me because you can't look them up. You have to be able to see a word and break it apart. And it's to me it's a piece of cake, now, but early on I found it extremely difficult, strangely.
I wonder with his Tomas's poetry in particular, where it's not a narrative poem, there's not a storyline that you're following as you're translating. And so each line, each image becomes so important and being able to convey that metaphor. Were there particular words? I guess you mentioned one, the orthoceritites, but were there other particular words that you struggled with in making that translation or phrases that you
Oh,
found?
often.
Yeah.
There's idiom. I remember our youngest daughter when we were there played soccer, football, and at one of her for her that she was on a soccer team, and as parents you work the concession stand, to make money for the team, and I was getting to practice my Swedish with all these mothers. And a lot sweet, this Swedish, like it's called goodies. They're just sweets, and they're very popular. So there was a lot of sweets being sold, and in Swedish I had said the equivalent of I'd said to one of the mothers in during halftime the girls all came and bought so much candy, so many goodies. And I said, to the mothers collectively, wow, in Swedish, they really have a sweet tooth. And they all looked at me, you know, like, That is so strange. What do you mean by that? And and that's kind of the reverse of,
Mm.
just reading things and not being sure whether it's a strange moment in the poetry, whether it's, idiomatic. And so there's a lot of that. Uh, I'm trying to think if I have another example. I do remember, at the time, my husband's secretary, who is Swedish, and obviously we were, that's he was working there, and I had asked her about a line in a poem. And I just said, I just have no idea what this is. And I think it was in November in the GDR, and it was the line caramels of granite. I'm sort of having to dig deep in my memory, but and she had, I'm still not totally sure I understand it, honestly. And she had a lot of trouble. She said, "Oh, I know what it means, but I don't think I can put it into words." So I mean, it's kind of part of the process of translation. You do your best, and sometimes you don't get it right, and that's, part of it. But uh,
And maybe part of the fun of it. No?
oh, absolutely. It's great. And there's just such an opportunity to learn and to take the time to understand the references, cultural references, historical references. And that's all part of the work. And so it is. It's fun and enlightening, and it's kind of what I mean by those translation rabbit holes. There are many, and any translator, I'm sure, is right now nodding their heads because you can just spend so much time, not even on the work that the word or the line or paragraph or whatever that you are working on. You end up, getting shunted off into the great beyond of information and um
Well, you must really live with a poem in a different way. I was thinking in my very first poetry classes was with Betsy Scholl, and I know Betsy is on here now. And one
Oh,
of our
hi.
assignments was, each week you could write about a poem of someone else's or you could memorize it. And I realized that the process of memorization made me think about every word choice. Like,
Mm.
why was it this word instead of this word that came to my head that was in that line? And it sounds as if in your process of translation, it's even more so. Why is it this word? What is this word or phrase or line? And how does it relate to the rest of the poem?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I realize, well, hi, Betsy. You got a wonderful teacher there, Meg. Um, yeah, the I know Allegro in Swedish and in English by heart, but I always feel a little bit worried that I might flub up, so I have it in front of me. But absolutely, you do. I think you embody it, um, and my process for translating, from one draft to the next is not until the very final couple of drafts do I lose sight of the original lines. It's just important for me and helpful to me to just keep being reminded of what I'm actually working from in terms of the sound, the actual words and the sense and the sound and so yes, you really, really do, or I feel that you really do take it in differently. And it is helpful. I mean, it's just like careful reading, close reading, that that memorizing, I think, is a wonderful tool, or rereading. Absolutely.
there's a poem about his music from, not a poem, a question here or comment from Scott Miner.
Oh, hi,
And
Scott.
He's saying, is it possible that Tranströmer's poetics are something like melody, as in classical music without words? It's hard to describe his greatness, his art, but it's hard to describe that feature in melody as well. It's the whole poem, of course, but when it gets this good, it seems mysterious in some way. His mysticism feels like direct knowledge somehow, beyond but also inclusive of the human version.
Hmm. Wow. I don't, beautifully put, Scott. And melody. I couldn't disagree with that. I mean, I think that yes, I'm trying to think of what it was that Robert Bly so astutely said about Tomas being these aren't his exact words, and there was a time when I actually knew what he said, but it was, that Tomas is tapped into some different part of the universe than the rest of us, or something like that. And if
Mm.
anybody knows, you can put it in the chat. Um, but yes, I think. That is true. I've never really thought of it in terms of melody, but it makes sense. And part of, often when I read and it's very important to understand that music was critical in his life. And there are also poems that really aren't that musical intentionally. And November in the GDR, I think, is one of those. But
Mm.
but I don't know really even know how that can be totally true because he was so immersed in the world of music. And whenever I would visit, he always played for me. That was one part of the one part of our time together. And so yeah, I think you could say that. And when you look at those longer poems like Schubertiana, where he's specifically talking about these two, I believe it's two different string quintets, C major and F minor, if I'm not mistaken. And you can feel that the music is the driver of the poem, and it's the driver of the long lines and that sense. And then other poems of his, like the Baltics, where they're long, sweeping, where I think he said in his letters that he was trying a different music there. Um, so, um, yeah, they're different melodies. Mm.
So Betsy had a question related to that, and she says, I'm curious about Trummer's shift from the brief poems and those wonderful long poems. Did he compose both types at the same time, or did they come from very different impulses?
I think, and well, I don't, I'm not necessarily a scholar um, on his work and from the point of view of what drove poems, although we did talk, a fair amount, and I have read both in Swedish and in English the letters, the airmail, the collection of letters between he and Robert Bly, where you can learn a lot about certain of the poems and what the catalyst was and where he was in a certain period of time. But I think that he does talk. I believe he does talk specifically about the Baltics in that way, that he's shifting and he's trying a different music. So Betsy, I think you know, that's intentional. That's uh and you can see the period where he has I don't remember what collection, but he's trying out prose poems as well, and there's a number of them in one of these collections. And then, of course, after the stroke, those last two books of poetry are quite spare. The last one, The Great Enigma, is mostly haiku, and but still just so much, just that same mind, that same just rapidly, moving between these different realms, is still there. So I think that the influences are there's the music, and then there's the time, the time and think what things were happening in the world, and also his conscious decisions to try something different. His very first um, collection, the 17 poems that was published when he was so young. I mean, he wrote some of those while he was in high school, basically. And he kind of jokes about, um, fixing them up so he could put them in there. But they're in different, meters that he never really did much with after that book. And so, um, yeah, I think he experimented greatly, and it is interesting, and it's what makes it fun to translate. Also, um,
So someone is asking, Jennifer Wallace, are there other Swedish poets who interest you?
thank you, Jennifer, for asking that. There are, and many, and I have just received the beautiful book of Ida Sjögren's. I'm sorry, I don't have it with me, but C.D. Eskilsson has just translated, and I can't wait to get to dive into that. I am actively translating a different Swedish poet right now. And it is someone whose work I had loved, but I was actually in the process of taking a break from translation, but I was approached to work on this, and I'm having a great deal of fun with it. It's Harry Martinson, and it's a particular book of his. And I was so excited about being offered this opportunity, because I've always admired his work, and this was something I hadn't heard of, and I'm completely blown away by it. So, and I really would love to. I'm just getting introduced to some other, try to keep my introduction to some other poets um, who have recently been brought to my attention. But yeah, anyway, there's a lot of great work out there.
So and also I'm curious, is there, how would you place his work in sort of a broader canon of poetry? Um, I've heard reference to the surrealists or reference to certain influences on him. What would you say were his major influences and perhaps other poets that you feel were comparable writing in the same time period?
Um, I'm not sure I feel qualified to answer that question, honestly.
Okay.
I I think that, I think he's um well, the more I get into translating Martinson, I'm starting to see some interesting parallels that I wouldn't have known without doing this work. But I think we may have other people in the room who could probably enlighten us a little bit more on that. And I know it's really interesting. I mean, the thing you're making me think about is Thomas's, that word, maybe Scott mentioned that, of mysticism.
Hmm.
He's been referred to as a religious, sometimes religious poet, which I'm not so sure of, but there's just really interesting, he has a really interesting relationship with this higher power that he talks about and explores in different ways, some more overtly than others. And that interests me. Uh, but I don't know what canon I'd put Thomas in.
Hmm.
If anybody wants to throw that in the chat.
Carl Little says, wasn't he associated with leaping poetry?
Well, he was associated with Robert Bly, who was associated with Leaping Poetry, but I think you absolutely could I mean, I think you absolutely could say that. That, you know, and that speaks directly to that, you know, just moving so quickly between, um, you know, between the here and now and your everyday life and those other places that he goes so easily. And you know, I guess we call that leaping. Um, it just sounds so intentional, and with Tomas, it just seems so built in, so built into how his mind works.
More intuitive. Leslie Ullman says, I think his work is influenced by surrealism, but not the jarring kind, more the kind that reveals hidden affinities between seemingly unlike phenomenon, like Magritte's paintings.
Wonderful, Leslie. That wonderful. I agree with that. Yes.
Nice. Nice. God, there's so many questions, and I'm missing so many of them. But here's one from Rosemary Gates. Did getting to know Tomas help you understand the meaning of the poems as you translated?
Interesting question, Rosemary. Um, I don't know that I don't know that it helped me understand the meaning of poems, although we did talk quite a bit. And when I say we, I mean Tomas was had expressive aphasia, so that means that his replies were, you know, not his wife Monica had this amazing ability to seemingly translate his kind of gestures, and she's been his major reader. Um, but um, but I got to see the person in his place and the real power of the music in his life. And we did talk about you know, with Monica shared kind of some of the background on some of the poems where some of the, you know, what some of the catalysts were, you say, what some of the
Mm.
triggering moments and that kind of thing. And you know, so in that way there's, you know, there's some perspective. And when we went over some of the poems, there was, you know, back and forth about some word choices, and that would, you know, provide me with, you know, kind of more information. But I think it's just the experience, you know, how you feel when you're with a human, when you're in a room with somebody, you get a lot of information that isn't the words that come out of their mouth. It's just the whole of a person. And so that's how I learned, I think. You know, I learned a great deal in that way. Just the presence of him and the environment of their apartment and what they surrounded themselves with um and yeah, and you know, all keeping in mind that Tomas is not able to say anything to me about the poems. It's through his wife, which is a whole
Mm.
other thing.
Did he encourage you or give you any advice on writing poetry?
No.
No.
What I have because of what I said, he had expressive aphasia.
Yeah.
So, if this is, so leave you with an image maybe, is when I definitely, thanks to Jean Valentine, had the, you know, the nerve to share my translation of the Sorrow Gondola, the poems in the Sorrow Gondola, and gave that to them. And then sometime later, we got together and talked about it. Um, the poem, there would be, we didn't really talk about all the poems. I can't remember if there's 18 or 13 poems in that collection, but we, you know, but Thomas, I mean, Monica had said that she and Thomas, that they read the manuscript and they both discussed They discussed it, and then, when we got together, there were, sort of faint, shaky lines under certain words in certain poems, and that was clearly Tomas. And so that was his way of speaking to me in a way. That's how I think about it, because he would not be able to or have
Mm.
expressed. It doesn't mean he didn't understand and didn't couldn't read, but he did not, he lost the ability to express um, what's in his head when he had that stroke. And that's something to think about. So, indirectly, I think of those shaky underlines as the point at, the way we talk. So we never, we in our discussions that he was in the room for, that Monica was his translator, we can say, we talked about a lot of things, um, but not in particular about poetry or my poetry. We did, I mean, we talked about poetry in general, and um, so.
Wow. So there are lots of questions, and I'm kind of going back and forth to say something. I don't know if we touched on the musicality a little bit, but there's one from Rosemary Gates that I'm not sure I asked it. How did attending to the musicality of the poems in Swedish influence your choice of words and phrases in English?
Well, very much so. Um, with the caveat that it's I mean, as I'm translating, I had mentioned before that I keep the Swedish line in view, right, right above the line that I'm working on, translating line, so that I can keep hearing and keep rereading and seeing that line to keep informing me as I keep, trying to hone it. And so I am trying really hard to think about the music, but it's not going to be the same, rhythm and music, because Swedish has completely different inflections. So, yeah, I think the simple answer to that question is very much keeping it in mind. Um, very much.
Mm. My husband, Roger, is asking, how well did he speak and read English?
His English was impeccable, and I, of course, did not experience that, but I was told that, and I've read about it, and there's probably people sitting, that are listening in who have probably heard him give readings in the U.S. And I've heard, stories that his English was so impeccable that he sometimes when he read, this is way before I did any
Yeah.
translations, but that he would sometimes combine different translations when he was reading his work in translation, because he's obviously not going to come here and read his work in Swedish. And so and Monica told me, his he lost his Swedish after his English after the
Oh,
stroke.
really?
But when she's saying he lost it, I mean, it's so clear to me that he was processing and understanding what was being said. In the beginning, in our first meetings, we were speaking in English, but pretty quickly we switched over, and then we're speaking in Swedish, because by that time um, I was thrown into the fire there, I guess. But my Swedish was good enough that I could kind of hang on and keep it going. But yes, it was impeccable. And you'll see, if you've read his letters, letter exchange, wonderful letter exchange with Robert Bly in the book called Airmail, that those were written not in Swedish, but in English. So anything, so the book is in Swedish. It's also published in Swedish. I believe it was published in Swedish. In fact, I know it was before in English, but it was translated into Swedish.
And could he still write after his stroke?
I I think, yeah, well, he did, and I'm not totally clear on. I'm pretty sure that I think I mentioned that the books that came out after the stroke were a couple of collections of poetry and the prose collection. And I am pretty darn sure, I know, because I'm pretty sure Monica had told me that the prose pieces were already underway. And 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 yes, I believe my understanding is that he was writing. I think he probably had some of the poems for the Sorrow Gondola, and that he was writing, and obviously in the last collection, The Great Enigma, which is very spare and mostly haiku, amazing, amazing. Um, and but I think it just got to be more difficult.
So this is an interesting, maybe segue to concluding with a poem, but someone's Kavita Kanpal, if I'm pronouncing that right, is asking, do you have a favorite poem or series of poems?
It's such a hard question. I mean, I think I have, the poem I read, Allegro, it's hard to not have that be my favorite poem in certain ways because it just daily and now in our world just feels so of the moment, and it's just so beautiful and it covers so much territory, let's say. Um, but every time before I read, I I start over before I'm going to do a reading, and I sit down with the book and I just look through and I decide what's striking me at the moment, at this moment. And I'm always worried that I'm going to keep picking the same poems, but I don't. I always pick
Oh,
Allegro, but I don't. And because different things are happening, this is, maybe speaking to that, kind of question of influence, but different things are happening in my head, in the world, outside, seasonal, whatever. And so I think that maybe it's like seasons. I always say the season we're in is my favorite season, and I have to say, and I mean Tomas's poems are like that. So I don't think I can answer that. Other, I'd have to cop out and say it's Allegro. Um, yeah, and in
well,
fact, the poem Meg had asked me to, that we finish up with a poem, and and that was extremely difficult. And I went back and forth between a few poems, but well, I'll tell you when if we're ready. Are we ready to do that last poem, Meg?
I'm going to give maybe one more
Okay.
opportunity for a question before we do that. And there was something that came to my mind that if clearly we have people that are huge fans of his work and knowledgeable on here, but I'm sure we also have people that are relatively new, as I am, to his work. Where would you suggest that someone begin?
In terms of the
Which poems, or a book, or a section of your book? But what would be
yeah,
the
yeah,
best
I can.
introduction?
Um, because you're not going to find, it would be great if I had like the each collection separate in a small book. I think that would be, you could pick from that because there's the giant collection of all of everything in the Blue House, which is it's a lot to digest. Um, and you know, in Brightside, I write an afterword. David Wojan has written a beautiful introduction, and at the end, um, I, the afterword is really very personal, and some of the details I talked to you today about, it's just about that, my connection and how I came to the work and my experience of being with Tranströmer. Not so that might add a kind of a nice, even though it's at the end of the poems, and then. Honestly, I would say if you're new and you don't want to feel overwhelmed, I mean, these are both, they look unwieldy because they have the Swedish on the other side, which doubles the length of it. But there's no reason why you can't just thumb through and look for a poem that looks like you could manage it. And maybe I would say to you, go pick that poem Allegro and take a look at it and just see, you heard what I talked about earlier and why I keep coming back to it. And maybe it's just kind of immersing yourself in a poem like that to, just say what is it about this that I like. Um, I wouldn't I'd say his first, if you get one of the books, you're going to miss some things in Bright Side, and that's the problem with that's this book is you get the afterword, but you don't get some of the and you will get Allegro in there, and you'll get a lot of the poems, all of the poems that were written after his stroke, minus everything that was in The Great Enigma. Anyway, um, yeah, I think that's the best advice I can give you, honestly, is just to find the book, get it out of the library, whatever, and um, just thumb through it and see what looks like something you feel like you can tackle. Try Allegro. Look at poems like the ones I read. Maybe take the poems, just pick the ones I read and then go back and look at them again and see what strikes you. I've talked about some of them. Tracks, Face to Face, that fourth section of Schubertiana, To Friends Behind a Border with the Fossils, and Memories Watch Me, which was written 10 years before the his prose pieces came out, which have the same name. Now, that's kind of interesting. That's a short little poem, and then Allegro.
But I have to say that this volume is wonderful, and there's
It
so
is
many
wonderful.
entry points, Patty. And sometimes I'll pick it up and I'll be caught by an image or a season or something like that, or the music or whatever. So I think there are lots of reasons to come to a
Yeah,
poem.
Thomas said something once somewhere. I know I read this in an interview that, just sometimes when you're reading a poem and you're not quite, um, you know, you're not you're not quite getting it all, or just think about it as somebody's dream. You're reading somebody's dream.
Mm,
And because it frees you up from having to expect a certain kind of thinking and sense, we'll call it. And I don't know, I think that's a really useful um, piece of advice.
nice. I'm going to ask you to end with, but I just want to read Leslie Ullman suggests Bly's volume Friends. You Drank Some Darkness, three Swedish poets, was her introduction to Tranströmer, and it hooked her right away.
There you go. Good suggestion,
So,
Leslie. It's a wonderful book.
well, thank you so much, Patty. I'd love to sort of wrap with poetry in our ears. So I asked if you would leave us at the end of this with a poem that you choose to read.
I absolutely will. And I'll find it first. So I think that it's quite possible that this is his most well-known poem. And yet for no particular reason, I have not shared it at a reading in ages, and it seems incredibly appropriate um, today, as appropriate today as it was in 1979. And because it's just six short lines, I will read it in Swedish also. Um, Från mars 79, trött på alla som kommer med ord men inget språk. För jag till den snötäckta ön. De vilda har inga ord. De oskrivna sidorna breder ut sig åt alla håll. Jag stöter på svaren av rådjursklöver i snön. Språk, men inga ord. From March of 79. Tired of all who come with words but no language, I headed for the snow-covered island. The wild has no words. Unwritten pages spread out in every direction. I come upon tracks of roe deer in the snow. Language, but no words. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Oh, that was just beautiful. And thank you, Patty. It's been so informative and delightful to talk with you and just hear the music of those poems in our ears. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. And thank you for all those hearts that are just exploding over the screen. Woo, I love that. That's just wonderful. All of you. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks again. The Poets Corner, what an amazing list of things that you're doing and events. And I applaud you, really, all of you. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thanks for being here.
Bye, everyone.
And thank all of you for being here to listen today.